change us.
This is the base. We're under attack. They're weapons. There's something wrong with people.
You're the first.
Lieutenant Voss, you're infected.
You're not a victim. You are the beginning. This is just the beginning.
The first sign was the silence. Erebus 9 was never quiet. The colony's mining rigs droned endlessly, the hum of industrial machinery vibrating through the metal-plated ground. Workers shouted over comms, transport shuttles roared as they ascended to orbit, and even in the dark hours, the wind howled through the narrow canyons of the settlement. But now, silence. Lieutenant Doran Voss stood outside Barracks 17, his pulse pounding. His HUD flickered, glitching, the atmospheric readings dropping to 0 for a split second before resetting. He turned his eyes skyward and saw the ships. They slid into view from the darkness of space, black masses against the distant sun, too many to count. Not human, not any species they had encountered before. The alarm sirens blared, but too late. The first beams struck down. The ground shuddered as blue-green light poured from the sky, lancing through the colony's defenses. The watchtower's reinforced walls didn't even slow the impact. 1 second it was there, the next, a column of light carved it in half, sending molten steel cascading down in a glowing shower. Voss ducked, shielding his face as the heat washed over him. He heard screams, hundreds of them. The entire comms network was filling with overlapping voices, desperate calls for orders, for help. Then he saw them, the first victims. Sergeant Miller had been a few feet ahead when the energy beam struck nearby. He should have been dead. Should have been turned into a pile of scorched remains. Instead, he was still standing, but something was wrong. His flesh rippled unnaturally, his veins swelling as if something crawled beneath them. His fingers spasmed, curling inward like a corpse's last twitch. Then his skin began to split, peeling apart layer by layer, exposing something shimmering beneath, something translucent, shifting like wet glass pulsing with unnatural light. Miller turned to Voss. His eyes, what was left of them, were empty sockets filled with flickering static, his mouth opening in a soundless scream. And then he lunged. Voss barely managed to roll out of the way. He hit the ground hard, his rifle clattering beside him. He scrambled back, watching in horror as Miller convulsed, his limbs elongating, his bones crackling as they reshaped themselves mid-motion. His uniform had fused into his body, his flesh knitting over the fabric, absorbing it as his entire structure twisted into something that was no longer human. Then it wasn't just Miller. All around him, the survivors began to change. Some collapsed into writhing, flesh-knitting mounds, their bodies adapting to the energy exposure in ways the human form was never meant to withstand. Others screamed until their vocal cords dissolved, their voices warping into static and distorted echoes, as if their very existence was no longer aligned with reality. Voss tried to run. His boots pounded against the metal flooring as he sprinted toward the nearest bunker. The sky was still burning, more beams carving into the colony, igniting fuel depots, melting entire blocks into slag. The air was thick with the stench of ionized flesh, of burning metal, and something worse, something unnatural. The Karesh weren't just here to destroy them, they were remaking them. A pulse of heat lashed across his side as another beam grazed his arm. Voss felt his nerves ignite, raw agony crawling into his bones. He expected to feel the searing pain of plasma burns, expected his flesh to melt away, but instead, his skin shimmered. He gasped, clutching his arm, his breath coming in ragged gulps. No pain, no charred flesh, but something was moving beneath his skin, something spreading through his veins like liquid metal. His fingers trembled as he pulled back his sleeve. His flesh was glowing. A deep, pulsing light ran under his skin, following the paths of his veins, like something alive was growing inside him. His arm hardened, the texture of his skin shifting, not burned, not scarred, but crystalline, like tempered glass infused with alien fire. A hand grabbed his shoulder. Voss spun, rifle raised, only to see Jennings, wide-eyed, his chest heaving. "Jesus, Voss, what the hell is happening?" His voice cracked with barely controlled panic, his gaze darting between Voss's glowing arm and the things shambling toward them from the ruins of the barracks. "We need to move," Voss rasped. The Hollow Ones, once their squad mates, their friends, were still changing. The Karesh had left, their ships vanishing as quickly as they'd come, but their attack had never been about extermination. They hadn't come to kill humanity, they had come to transform them. The world was broken. Erebus 9 had become a graveyard of the living, a place where the dead still moved, and the survivors were something worse. Dorn Voss crouched in the ruins of the colony's command center, his rifle clutched tight, his breathing steady despite the nausea clawing at his gut. The emergency lights flickered in the darkness, bathing the room in an eerie, blood-red glow. The air was thick with the smell of ionized flesh, of something burned but not dead, something still changing. Jennings sat across from him, back against the cold metal wall, his hands trembling as he checked his weapon. His face was slick with sweat, eyes sunken, haunted. "They're out there," Jennings whispered, his voice barely audible. Voss already knew. The Hollow Ones were moving through the colony, hunting. At first, they had seemed normal, just injured survivors, their bodies marked with the same unnatural pulsing light Voss had seen in himself. But it became clear, too late, that they weren't survivors at all. They were something else. He had seen one up close, Private Lynn, one of the few who had made it to the bunker after the attack. She had been quiet at first, shaking, holding her rifle so tight her fingers went white. Then, slowly, her skin began to ripple. Not in pain, not like a wound healing, but like something inside her was pressing outward, testing the limits of its new form. Her breath turned erratic, her eyes flickering like static-filled screens. She had looked at them, at him, as if she recognized them, as if she knew who she had been. Then she stopped blinking. Then she stopped breathing. And yet, she still stood. The others hadn't realized at first. They had thought she was just in shock, just trying to adjust to the horror of what had happened. Until she opened her mouth, and a sound came out that wasn't human. a low, oscillating whine like broken radio waves. The air around her had begun to bend, a faint warping distortion spreading outward. And then, her veins burst open, not with blood but with light, her flesh peeling apart in slow, delicate strips that didn't fall. They hung there, weightless, as if she were unraveling into something that didn't need a body anymore. Jennings had screamed. Someone had fired. Lynn didn't die. The bullets had passed through her, her body absorbing the impact with a soft, glassy crack, as if she was made of half-solid energy. Then she had turned toward them with a jerky, unnatural twitch, her lips parting too wide. They ran. Now there were dozens of them, maybe more. The survivors who had taken the full force of the Karesh weapons had become this. Not alive, not dead. Their bodies flickered between states, their voices a mess of corrupted frequencies, their movements fractured, skipping like a video file with missing frames. Some of them hadn't changed all the way yet. Voss had seen one of them, Santos, sitting in the wreckage of the old fuel depot, his back against the wall, crying. His arms had been stretched, unnaturally elongated, the skin translucent, showing moving veins of pulsing light underneath. His mouth twitched, repeating the same 3 words over and over. "I'm still here." He wasn't. Not anymore. Voss turned his attention back to the corridor outside the command bunker. The emergency lights buzzed, sending weak pulses of crimson through the wreckage. The station was on emergency power, and once that ran out, they'd be in complete darkness. Jennings shuddered. "We need to get off this planet." "We will." Voss flexed his fingers. His left arm still didn't feel right. Where the Karesh beam had grazed him, his flesh had hardened, taken on a shiny glass-like texture. It should have hurt. It didn't. It felt stronger, denser. Jennings swallowed hard. His gaze darted to Voss's arm, and for a moment there was something in his eyes, something like fear. "You're not changing, are you?" Voss didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know. A sound echoed through the halls, a faint electric hum. Voss stiffened. Jennings gripped his rifle tighter. The hollow ones were close. Then, movement. A flickering shadow shifted down the corridor, its form stuttering in and out of visibility, the air around it distorting. And then, another. Then another. Voss's heart pounded. The hollow ones weren't wandering aimlessly anymore. They were hunting, and they knew exactly where to look. They had to keep moving. Dorr and Voss led the way through the shattered remains of Erebus 9, his rifle tight in his grip, his breath coming in measured, controlled exhales. He counted each one, kept his mind focused. It was the only thing that kept him from losing himself in the horror that surrounded them. Jennings was behind him, limping, his side wrapped in makeshift bandages. Though what good they would do against whatever was happening to them, Voss didn't know. The hollow ones were everywhere now, the colony crawling with things that used to be human. And then there was him. Voss could feel it inside him. The change. The same energy that had twisted the hollow ones into something else was inside him too. But his was different. Slower. More controlled. His arm, the part of him that had taken the blast, was stronger now. Denser. the veins beneath the skin pulsing faintly in the dark. He didn't feel sick. He didn't feel weak. He felt alive, and that terrified him. Jennings let out a shuddering breath. How the hell did we end up here? Voss didn't answer. They all knew. The Karesh had done something to them. Their attack hadn't been about extermination. If they had wanted to wipe out the colony, they could have done it in seconds. But instead, they had used those energy weapons. Weapons that didn't burn, didn't kill outright. Weapons that changed them. And the Hollow Ones, they weren't accidents. The Karesh had designed them. The hallway ahead was dark. The emergency lights had finally failed, leaving only the dull red glow of firelight reflecting off the twisted metal walls. The air was thick with the smell of burnt flesh, of something else beneath it, something unnatural. Voss and Jennings stepped over the bodies. Some were human corpses, others were midway through becoming something else. The transition wasn't uniform. Some people had twisted into Hollow Ones immediately. Others had changed slowly, and some never finished changing at all. Jennings stopped suddenly, his breath catching. Jesus Christ. Voss followed his gaze. The thing on the floor had once been Corporal Reed. He was still alive. His body had folded in on itself, his limbs elongating as if he had been stretched like soft clay. His chest had collapsed inward, yet somehow his heart was still beating, visible through his translucent flesh. The veins inside him pulsed, filled with something that wasn't blood anymore. His eyes flickered open. His mouth moved. No sound came out. Just a faint, warped distortion, like the crackle of a broken radio signal. Jennings took a step back. Reed? The thing that had been Reed twitched violently, his jaw unhinged, stretching too far, his fingers curling into unnatural angles. His bones weren't bones anymore. Then he spoke. Or rather, something inside him did. It's still growing. Jennings lifted his rifle, hands shaking. Holy shit. Voss grabbed his arm. Wait. Reed's face twitched. His skin bulged, shifting, rearranging, like something beneath it was trying to press through. He wasn't Reed anymore, but he wasn't fully one of them either. He was something in between. Growing, Voss asked, keeping his voice steady. Reed shuddered. His body cracked, his flesh splitting along invisible seams. Yet, he didn't bleed. The light inside him flared brighter, his skin becoming thin and glass-like, his form flickering like a hologram out of sync with reality. It doesn't stop, Reed whispered, voice layered as if two voices spoke from the same throat. It doesn't stop changing. Then his face broke apart. Not like an injury, like a cocoon splitting open. Jennings fired. The shot hit dead center, a perfect round through the skull. But Reed didn't die. His body absorbed the impact, the bullet sinking in without resistance, as if it had been fired into water instead of flesh. Then he moved. Fast, faster than anything should move. Voss barely had time to react before Reed lunged. But it wasn't a normal movement. It was like a glitch in real life, his form snapping forward in a series of distorted flickers, his limbs jerking too fast, too fluidly. Jennings screamed as Reed's hands pierced through his side, not tore, not stabbed, pierced, sliding through his body like phasing through mist, yet still solid enough to tear at his insides. Jennings fired wildly, screaming. Voss acted on instinct. His left arm, his changed arm, moved on its own. He grabbed Reed's shifting, pulsing flesh, expecting it to be intangible like before. But when he touched him, Reed froze. The energy inside Reed reacted violently to Voss's touch. His entire form stuttered, the shifting light in his body flaring erratically. Reed screamed. A horrible, warped sound like metal twisting under extreme heat. And then he collapsed in on himself, his flesh shattering into 1,000 slivers of raw, glowing crystal. Voss stood there, breathing hard. His hand was still tingling, the pulsing glow in his veins brighter than before. Jennings coughed, clutching his side. Blood leaked through his fingers, his face pale. What the hell was that? Voss didn't answer, because now he understood. The Hollow Ones weren't just random mutations. They were incomplete transformations. The Karesh hadn't failed to kill them. This had been the plan all along. And Voss, he wasn't becoming one of them. He was becoming something else entirely. The ship arrived 3 days after the sky burned. By then, Doran Voss was the only one left. Jennings hadn't made it through the night. His wound had been too deep, his body too weak. Voss had stayed with him until the end, watching as his breathing slowed, his eyes fluttered shut. And then, he didn't change. Jennings had died human. Voss had buried him beneath the wreckage of the colony's comm tower, marking the grave with a twisted shard of metal. There was no one left to remember him, no one left to mourn, except Voss himself. The Hollow Ones still roamed the ruins of Erebus 9, their forms flickering in and out of sight, ghosts of what had once been his people. They didn't come for him anymore. They didn't hunt him. They knew. He was no longer prey. He was becoming one of them. No, not one of them. Something else. He could feel it now, spreading through his body, every nerve thrumming with raw, alien power. His flesh had hardened, taken on the smooth, glass-like texture of the others. His bones no longer felt solid, more like woven strands of energy, wrapped tight beneath his skin. When he moved, he felt too light, as if gravity had loosened its hold on him. And worst of all, he didn't feel afraid anymore. The transformation should have horrified him. It should have made him want to fight. But it didn't, because it felt right. The ship's arrival was a bright spot in the ruined sky, its engines roaring as it cut through the burning atmosphere. Voss stood at the colony's edge, watching it descend, watching as the dust of the dead world rose beneath its thrusters. A rescue team rushed out, clad in reinforced EVA suits, weapons drawn. They scanned the wreckage, searching for survivors. Their radios crackled with questions, panic, disbelief at what they saw. A colony reduced to shadows and silence. No bodies, no signs of life, only him. Voss stepped forward. The moment they saw him, they froze. One of them, a woman, her voice sharp, controlled, lifted a scanner toward him. The device beeped frantically, flashing warnings in bright red. Not human. Voss looked down at himself. His arms were fully changed now, the glow beneath his skin pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The air around him hummed, a barely perceptible distortion, as if space itself bent slightly in his presence. They had every right to fear him, but he was still Doran Voss. He took another step forward. The woman flinched, her hand moving toward her sidearm. "Don't," he said. His voice sounded strange, layered, like two voices speaking at once. He swallowed hard, steadying himself. "I'm not." He stopped, because he wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't human anymore, but he wasn't one of them either. The Karesh had come to transform humanity, to reshape their biology, to turn them into something else. They had succeeded. The Hollow Ones were the failures, unstable, incomplete, broken in the process of becoming. But Voss, he was the end result, the final, perfected form of what the Karesh had tried to create, a bridge between what humanity had been and what it was meant to become. The soldiers on the rescue team exchanged looks, uncertain. The woman with the scanner swallowed. "Voss?" she asked, hesitantly. "Lieutenant Doran Voss?" He nodded slowly. They didn't lower their weapons, and he didn't blame them. They saw him for what he was now, something other than human, something they didn't understand. He was the first of his kind, and that terrified them. But the worst part, Voss understood now. The Karesh hadn't invaded Erebus 9 to conquer or destroy. They had come to prepare humanity for something greater. And it wasn't over, because as Voss stood there, staring at the soldiers who had come to take him home, he realized a terrifying truth. He could still hear them. Not the Hollow Ones, not the rescue team, but the Karesh themselves. Their presence was inside him, whispering, murmuring in a language he shouldn't understand, but somehow did. They weren't done with him yet. He felt his lips part, forming words before he even knew what he was saying. A message, not from him, from them. This is only the beginning. The soldiers tensed. The woman's eyes widened. And Voss? He simply smiled, because he knew it was true.